So today, we're going to trace the path of a strategy, how it goes from just an idea, a theory, into this really powerful data-driven weapon. We'll see how a concept on paper becomes a tool with some serious real-world consequences.
So this really is the central question, isn't it? When you're dealing with a network that's deeply embedded, one that operates through subtle control, how do you even begin to counter it? The strategy we're about to explore is one proposed answer to that very question. All right, so the whole thing kicks off with a theoretical concept called the ITE framework. You got to think of this as the blueprint, the absolute foundation for everything that comes next. So what exactly is IEE? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Identify, evoke, expose. The core idea here is to take the network's greatest strength, its secrecy, and flip it right on its head, turning it into a weakness. It works by creating what the source calls information asymmetry. You basically find a piece of information that the network's own members don't know, and you use that little secret to mess with their operations from the inside out.
Okay, let's break this down step by step. First up is identify. This is where a massive database, which the source calls Elon Musk's GeoIndex, is used to pinpoint the key players. Step 2 is evoke. That involves presenting those individuals with some implicating data to force them to react. And finally, the third step, expose, only kicks in if their reaction is actually criminal. So you can see it's a really calculated three-stage game plan.
But, a theory is just a theory until you test it, right? So let's dive into how this whole framework was put into practice in a very specific, super-controlled environment to see if it would actually work. And where did they choose for this test? A British private prep school. Now, according to the source, this was the perfect little laboratory. It's a small, self-contained system where you can clearly see the cause and effect of every single action.
And this is where things get really interesting and, frankly, a little unconventional. The weapon they used to evoke that reaction wasn't some secret file or a direct threat. Nope. It was a children's book called Miko's Secret, and copies were sent to the classmates of the author's son, their parents, and, of course, the school principal.
So the prediction here was that the network's absolute need for control would force them to confiscate these books. The author even framed it with this really sharp satirical question: will they organize a book-burning event? Now that phrase is powerful, right? It was designed to frame whatever the school did not as just some administrative decision, but as a modern act of censorship.
So, the experiment at the school? It was a big success. It proved the concept, but it immediately brings up a huge question. Okay, this works on a small scale with a handful of people, but how in the world do you scale that up? How you apply it systematically to, say, an entire region for maximum impact?
Well, the answer, it turns out, was to evolve. To move from this very specific, local tactic to a much broader, data-driven strategy. And this is what led to the development of a brand new metric, one designed for efficient targeting over a much, much wider area. It's called RAUM. That stands for Ranked Acres Under Management. And the formula is actually pretty simple. It's just acres under management divided by distance in miles. What it does is prioritize targets who control a lot of physical land and are also physically close. It's a clever way to measure not just influence on paper, but their real, practical power on the ground in a specific area.
And here, you can see exactly how it works in the real world. By crunching publicly available data, the RAUM metric spits out this ranked priority list. Suddenly, these abstract things like high schools are quantified and put in order. It creates a literal, actionable hit list for the next phase of the information campaign.
And this is the real genius of it, according to the source. The true power of RAUM isn't just about ranking land. It's about connecting that land, that physical space, to a specific, identifiable person who's in charge, like a school principal. It completely shifts the focus from some faceless organization to an individual who can be held accountable.
Okay, so this focus on land, it's not just about targeting people. According to the source, the network's whole underlying strategy of snapping up huge tracts of land has these massive, cascading effects that ripple out across all of society. The source material calls this a vicious cycle, and here's how it's laid out. First, the network buys up land to create these zones that are immune to electronic surveillance. Step 2, that drives up land prices, pushing regular people out. Step 3, those people are then forced into smaller, denser, vertical housing, think apartment buildings. And here's the crazy irony. Step 4, living in those dense buildings actually makes the general population more vulnerable to the very same RF eavesdropping, spying with radio waves, that the network is shielding itself from.
And what really pours gasoline on this fire, the source argues, is that this whole cycle is supercharged by a parallel, untaxed economy. It claims the network is using illicit funds to outbid regular, tax-paying folks for land, creating a game that ordinary people just can't win.
And hey, just to bring this back to the data we were talking about earlier, the source material points to a public website, spyhell.org, as a place where anyone can supposedly go and consult .geoindex database for themselves. Now, this strategy of using geography for security, it plays out on a global scale. The source presents this really stark contrast. On one hand, you have the UN headquarters in New York, which it calls a sitting duck because it's surrounded by a dense city. And on the other, you have the Mercosur headquarters in Uruguay, basically a modern fortress, surrounded by water and open land, designed for total surveillance immunity. This is presented as a perfect example of the network's security doctrine in action.
So that leaves us with this final pretty heavy thought. The source material is essentially arguing that if control over physical geography is the ultimate defense in our modern, surveilled world, then are our most important global institutions, sitting right in the middle of dense cities, fundamentally insecure by their very design? It's definitely a provocative question to chew on.